For 50 years, car collectors treated it as a ghost story, a Shelby prototype so rare it wasn't supposed to exist anymore, sent to the crusher like every other test mule from that era. Then a restoration team stopped chasing the wrong paper trail, followed a different set of numbers hidden underneath the Shelby badge, and found the car sitting in a Texas field, stripped down and forgotten. What they uncovered wasn't just a rare Mustang. It was a missing piece of Carroll Shelby's most experimental work, one that had quietly shaped a car millions of people have driven without ever knowing it. Before Carroll Shelby became one of the most influential names in American performance cars, he was a Texas-born racer whose career nearly ended because of his own heart. In 1959, he won the 24 Hours of Le Mans behind the wheel of an Aston Martin, sharing the victory with co-driver Roy Salvadori. It should have been the high point of a long driving career. Instead, a worsening heart condition forced him out of competitive racing almost immediately afterward. For most drivers, that would have been the end of the story. For Shelby, it became the start of a different one. If he couldn't outdrive Europe's best anymore, he decided he'd outbuild them instead, taking the lightweight British AC Ace and dropping American V8 power into it to create the Shelby Cobra, a car built specifically to embarrass the more refined machines it was up against. By the mid-1960s, Ford had its own problem it needed Shelby to help solve. Ferrari was dominating endurance racing, and Henry Ford II wanted to beat them badly enough to spend enormous sums trying. Shelby American's involvement helped turn Ford's GT40 program into a genuine winner, and Ford went on to beat Ferrari at Le Mans in 1966, then again in the following 3 years. That partnership is what cemented Shelby's reputation as more than a tuner or a garage tinkerer. He became the person American manufacturers turned to when they needed real performance credibility, not just marketing language. Around the same time, Ford wanted the Mustang, already a sales success, to earn some actual performance respect. The Shelby GT350 arrived in 1965, followed by the GT500 in 1967, and both cars turned an approachable, mass-market pony car into something that could genuinely compete. What most people don't realize is that Shelby's most interesting work often never made it anywhere near a dealership. Behind the cars that became famous, the Cobras, the GT350S, the GT500S, sat a much messier world of prototypes, engineering test mules, and experimental builds that were never meant to survive past the moment they'd serve their purpose. In the 1960s, prototype vehicles were treated as tools, not treasures. Once an engine, suspension setup, or styling idea had been tested and either adopted or rejected, the car built around it typically disappeared, sold off quietly, stripped for parts, or crushed outright. Nobody involved was thinking about future collector value. They were thinking about deadlines and results. That's exactly the reputation that followed one particular car for decades, a 1967 Shelby GT500 prototype known as Little Red. Unlike the fastback body most people picture when they think of a Shelby Mustang, Little Red was a notchback coupe, making it visually unusual from the start. Along with a later 1968 prototype nicknamed the Green Hornet, it was one of only 2 Shelby GT500 notchback coupes ever built. According to Barrett Jackson, the car was commissioned by Fred Goodell, Shelby American's chief engineer, and it was built at Ford San Jose assembly plant before being handed over to Shelby's team as a rolling test bed. Under the hood sat a 428 cubic inch V8, fitted with a Paxton supercharger, and at various points the car reportedly ran with twin superchargers as engineers pushed the setup further than anything available to customers. It also served as a platform for testing restyled body elements, including side scoops and tail panel treatments that were never part of a standard production Shelby. Little Red's influence didn't disappear even after the car itself did. According to reporting on the car's history, it made an appearance at a Ford preview event in Los Angeles, and its styling directly inspired the 1968 Mustang California Special, a model that borrowed its look without carrying over the underlying performance hardware. That's an important detail, because it means Little Red wasn't simply a dead end. Its visual DNA reached showrooms and customers in a different form, even while the actual prototype had vanished from view. After the testing had run its course, The standard procedure at the time was to send prototypes back to Ford to be scrapped, and for decades, that's exactly what most people believed had happened to Little Red. Ford's records and long-standing assumptions in the collector world both pointed toward the same conclusion. The car was gone, destroyed like nearly every other test mule from that era. The search for Little Red gained real momentum because of its sibling car, the Green Hornet. That 1968 Shelby GT500 prototype had been fitted with genuinely advanced features for the period, including independent rear suspension and electronic fuel injection, technology that wouldn't become common on production Mustangs for decades. The Green Hornet eventually ended up owned by Craig Jackson, chairman and CEO of Barrett Jackson, who spent years working with restoration specialist Jason Billups to document and restore it. During that process, the two started asking a natural question. If the Green Hornet had survived against all odds, was it possible that Little Red had too? Most people in the Shelby community treated that idea skeptically. Little Red had been missing since the late 1960s, and decades of searching by dedicated collectors and historians had turned up nothing. The breakthrough came from a shift in approach rather than a lucky discovery. For years, anyone searching for Little Red had been using its Shelby-assigned serial number, and that search consistently ran into dead ends. Jackson and Billups realized the car likely had a second identity buried underneath that Shelby designation, its original Ford VIN, assigned before Shelby's team ever got their hands on it. Once the team began tracing ownership records through that original Ford VIN instead, the trail that had gone cold for 50 years finally opened back up, working through old registrations and past ownership records that eventually pointed toward rural North Texas. On March 3, 2018, that trail led Jackson's team to the car itself, sitting in a Texas field where it had reportedly been stored by the same owner for around 2 decades. It wasn't found gleaming under a dust cover in a hidden collection. According to multiple reports on the discovery, the car was missing its supercharged 428 V8 and its 3-speed automatic transmission entirely, along with its front fenders and hood, and had clearly spent years exposed to the weather. To anyone unfamiliar with its history, it would have looked like just another worn-out old Mustang shell sitting among other project cars. To the people who understood what the VIN represented, it was one of the most significant finds in post-war American car collecting. Verifying the discovery took more than a visual inspection. Jackson's team worked with Mustang historian Kevin Marty, cross-referencing serial numbers, date codes, and original Shelby documentation to confirm what they'd found. Once that verification was complete, the car's identity was no longer in question. This was the genuine 1967 Shelby GT500 EXP prototype, the first of its kind ever built, and the only GT500 coupe produced by Shelby American. It also carried a handful of unusual distinctions on top of that. It was reportedly the only Shelby GT ordered with factory dual quad carburetors, and one of just 2 1967 GT cars fitted with a black Connolly leather interior. Part of what makes Little Red's survival so unlikely is exactly how prototype vehicles were typically handled at the time. Once a test car had done its job, there were straightforward business reasons to get rid of it. Liability concerns, protecting proprietary engineering, and simply not wanting an experimental vehicle with non-standard parts circulating outside the company's control. Reports on the car's history indicate it was in fact sent back toward that fate, following the same path as most prototypes of that period. But somewhere along the way, it slipped through the process instead of being destroyed. It was sold as a used vehicle, passed between several private owners over the years, and eventually ended up parked in that North Texas field. Its true identity apparently unknown to the people who had it. No one along that chain of ownership seems to have realized what they actually had, which is precisely how a piece of automotive history that valuable can disappear in plain sight for half a century. Once the car had been authenticated, Craig Jackson took on the job of restoring it, a process that stretched on for roughly 2 years, given how much of the car was missing and how little documented reference material existed for something this experimental. Jackson has spoken about wanting to bring the car back to its original condition rather than simply repairing it cosmetically, which meant sourcing or recreating period-correct parts for a vehicle that never had a standard factory specification to begin with, since it had been modified repeatedly throughout its working life as a test mule. Barrett-Jackson also opened up the restoration as something of a public research project, asking Mustang enthusiasts and historians to help piece together photographs, records, and first-hand accounts from the car's active years in the 1960s, since so little of its documented history had survived. The finished result was unveiled publicly on January 16, 2020, at the Barrett-Jackson auction in Scottsdale, Arizona, roughly 5 months after the Green Hornet's own restoration had been revealed. For the first time, the two experimental Shelby notchback coupes could be seen together, restored and confirmed as genuinely real rather than the half-mythical rumors they'd become among collectors over the decades. Jackson has described both cars as having been treated almost like urban legends before their rediscovery, existing mostly in old photographs, second-hand stories, and fading memories rather than as verified pieces of history. Their reveal together closed a gap that had existed in Shelby's story for more than 50 years. The importance of Little Red goes beyond its rarity or its eventual restoration. Prototype vehicles like this one represent something production cars simply can't. The ideas engineers and designers were willing to try before market realities, cost limits, and manufacturing constraints forced compromises. Production Shelbys show what the company was ultimately willing to sell to customers. Little Red and the Green Hornet show what Shelby and Ford's engineers were willing to experiment with when nobody outside the workshop was watching. The supercharging work done on Little Red, along with the styling elements that fed directly into the California Special, demonstrate that some of the ideas people associate with much later performance Mustangs were already being tested by Shelby's team decades earlier, well before the broader market or Ford's own production system was ready for them. That's also part of why the discovery mattered so much to people well outside the world of car auctions. It wasn't simply a case of a rare vehicle turning up after being lost. Plenty of valuable old cars get found in barns and fields every year. What made Little Red different is that its disappearance had become an accepted piece of automotive history, repeated for decades as settled fact, and its rediscovery forced historians and collectors to actively correct that record. It stands as a reminder that even in an area as heavily documented as Shelby's career, there can still be gaps, mistaken assumptions, and lost paperwork sitting quietly in old registration files, waiting for someone to look at the right set of numbers instead of the ones everyone else had already tried and failed with. Today, Little Red and the Green Hornet are frequently displayed together, and their combined story was eventually turned into documentaries produced in partnership with Barrett-Jackson, narrated by Carroll Shelby's grandson, Aaron Shelby, which aired on cable networks in 2021. For collectors and historians, the two cars represent something more meaningful than rarity alone. They're physical evidence of the experimental process that sat behind Shelby's more famous production models. Proof that long before a car ever reached a showroom floor wearing his name, it likely went through a much rougher, stranger, and more ambitious life as a test mule, built to answer a question rather than to be sold. Little Red spent 50 years answering that question quietly in a Texas field, waiting for someone to finally ask it the right way.